Hello, gentle students, gentle readers. I thought it might be a good idea before I begin this brief lecture with telling you why I say gentle readers or gentle students. It's because in the classical Chinese novel, often the translation of the very first few characters of a novel per chapter is gentle readers. And it's just a very genteel and tender way to address those to whom one is addressing. I think I read once in one novel, it was Kanguan, look, observer. But in any case, that's why I do that, because it's just a dignified way of addressing to whom one addresses. The other thing that is striking me is that as I begin this particular lecture, I'm noticing that in the room nearby is a slow cooker, and the slow cooker is making this entire area of my home smell absolutely marvelously. So I anticipate a bit of distraction from the smell of the wonderful cooking that's happening nearby. What is I think one of the most important topics when talking about Chinese literature, and of course this series of lectures is about Chinese literature, and especially the novel Dream of the Red Chamber, or Story of the Stone, Honglomang, or Shitoji. And one of the things that I think is crucial to reading Chinese literature, especially xiaoshuo or novels. The word xiaoshuo literally means small talk. But I think one of the most important things we can do to be good readers of Chinese literature, especially novels, is to read what are called the Dufa, the guides to reading, the how to reads. Du meaning read, fa means method, the methods for reading the text. And I'll be talking later about a certain man by the name of Zhang Xinzhi, who wrote a Dufa, a how to read essay on the novel Honglomang. It's a brilliant essay, and I'll talk about it shortly. But I just want to recommend to you this. I keep it photocopied and refer to it often. I want to recommend to you David Ralston's translation of Zhang Xinzhi's Dufa in a book that he wrote called How to Read the Chinese Novel, edited by David L. Ralston. And in this edited volume, of course, is a translation of Zhang Xinzhi's How to Read the novel Honglomang. So, but let's get started. I'd like to do a few readings from the English today and sort of think about them before we continue into talking about Zhang Xinzhi's Dufa. We've already discussed various ways that Chinese writers structured their writing, especially a sort of cosmological patterning in Chinese society called wuxing, which means the 5 phases, sometimes translated as the 5 elements. But elements seem rather static to me. I think a better translation of xing is phase, a movement, something that is in transition, something that is active. So wuxing, the 5 phases, I think is a better translation. And we've already discussed the use of wuxing cosmology in the narrative, but the second cosmological paradigm in late imperial Chinese fiction is another type of cosmology is equally present, and that is the yin-yang theory, the whole idea of yin and yang, of these polar opposites. And we've talked about yin and yang and polarity a bit as well. But Cao Xueqin is brilliant in that he uses the narrative of his text to actually tell his reader what his narrative structure is. So you will see within Cao Xueqin's text clues about, in his novel, clues about how to read his novel. And I chose one particular passage, and it's the passage in chapter 31. That is, Shi Xiangyun is the orphaned grandniece of grandmother Jia. By the way, that's who Shi Xiangyun is. And it discusses yin and yang with her personal maid. David Hawkes translates her as Kingfisher. And again, if you can read Chinese, you should certainly read this text in Chinese. But since most of my students do not read Chinese, we typically read the novel in the 5-volume version that was translated by David Hawkes. So in chapter 31, Shi Xiangyuan will have a dialogue with her maid Kingfisher. And I want to read that passage because in this copy it's pages 121 to 123. So it's a bit longish, but I'd like to read it out loud because this is a really excellent example of how Cao Shiqin will embed within the novel a key to how to read the novel. And it says this. So this is Shi Xiangyuan. The others thanked her and went off to look for various kith and kin, leaving Shi Xiangyuan alone with Kingfisher. Why aren't these water lilies out yet, said Kingfisher. It isn't time for them yet, said Xiangyuan. Look, they're going to be double-decker ones, like the ones in our lily pond at home, said Kingfisher. Our ones are better, said Xiangyuan. They've got a pomegranate tree here which has four or five lots of flowers growing one above the other on each branch, said Kingfisher. That's a double-decker. I wonder what makes them grow like that. Plants are the same as people, said Xiangyuan. The healthier their constitution, the better they grow. I don't believe that, said Kingfisher, with a toss of her head. If that were so, why don't we see people walking around with one head growing on top of the other? Xiangyuan was unable to avoid laughing at the girl's simplicity. I've told you before, you talk too much, she said. Let's see how can one answer a question like that? Everything in the world is molded by the forces of yin and yang. That means that besides the normal, the abnormal, the peculiar, the freakish, in fact, the thousands and thousands of different variations we find in things are caused by different combinations of yin and yang. Even if something appears that is so rare that one has never seen it before, the principle is still the same. So according to what you say, said Kingfisher, all the things that have ever existed from the time the world began right up to the present moment have just been a lot of yins and yangs. No, stupid, said Xiangyuan. The more you say, the sillier you get. Just a lot of yins and yangs, indeed. In any case, strictly speaking, yin and yang are not two things, but one and the same thing. By the time the yang has become exhausted, it is yin. By the time the yin has become exhausted, it is yang. It isn't a case of one of them coming to an end and then the other one growing out of nothing. That's too deep for me, said Kingfisher. What sort of thing is a yin-yang, I'd like to know. No one's ever seen one. You just answer that, miss. What does a yin and yang look like? Yin-yang is a sort of force, said Xiangyuan. It's the force in things that gives them their distinctive forms. For example, the sky is yang and the earth is yin. The water is yin and fire is yang. The sun is yang and the moon is yin. Ah, yes, now I understand, said Kingfisher happily. That's why astrologers call the sun the yang star and the moon the yin star. Holy name, said Xiangyuan. She understands. That's not difficult, said Kingfisher. But what about things like mosquitoes and fleas and midges and plants and flowers and bricks and tiles? Surely you're not going to say that they are all yin-yang too. Certainly they are, said Xiangyuan. Take a leaf of a tree, for example, that's divided into yin and yang. The side facing upwards towards the sky is yang. The underside facing towards the ground is yin. Kingfisher nodded. I see. Yes, I can understand that. But take these fans we are holding. Surely they don't have a yin and yang. Yes, they do. The front of the fan is yang. The back of the fan is yin. And the narrative goes on from there. So what do we get from this? Several things stand out. One, the world is molded by the forces of yin and yang. So everything is molded by the forces of yin and yang. Yin and yang the notion of polarities is in fact a lens through which to see all of reality. And that is also the lens through which one can view all of the novel. And Zhang Xinzhi will select the theory of yin and yang in particular, and especially yin and yang as it's expressed in the Chinese classic novel, the I Ching, the classic of changes, as a mode through which to describe the structural vicissitudes or the structural sort of construction of the novel, Hong Lo Meng. So, the rules of yin and yang. I've said this to many of my students in the past, but let me recount this just briefly. The material world consists of yin and yang. So there are 4 basic rules of yin and yang. 1, the material world consists of yin and yang. That is, everything that exists is yin and yang. And that was clearly expressed by Shi Xiangyun to Kingfisher, her maid, in this passage. And the second rule, yin becomes yang, and vice versa. And the third rule, yin contains yang, and vice versa. And then fourthly, yin creates yang, and vice versa. By the very fact that polarities exist, well, let me retrench a little bit and go backward. According to some classical Taoist way of thinking, there are no polarities. Polarities exist once one half of the polarity is either discerned or described or discovered or created. So if you say something is bad, then obviously for something to be bad, there must be something that you would describe as good. So therefore, by saying something is good or by saying something is bad, you are creating the other, right? So some Taoist ways of thinking would say there are no polarities unless you create them. Well, anyway, that's not so much what's happening in the novel. So much of the novel not only manifests the reality of yin and yang, but also the movement of yin and yang. So that's a really key, important thing. So, examples of yin and yang cosmology. So one thing that one sees in the novel is that you will have this idea of hot within cold. Right? Yin contains yang, yang contains yin, hot within cold, and vice versa, cold within hot. So how do you see that in the novel, right? So in chapter 30, it's actually summer, but on page 104, in I think it's volume 2, you see a little cloudlet brings a heavy shower, right? So you get a cold moment in the heat of summer. We also see the transition from yang to yin in the story when a happy scene in the novel, a yang scene, will suddenly turn into a yin moment. So for example, in chapter 32 in the novel, Bao Chai is discussing Bao Yu's sewing with Aroma. They're just sort of sitting there happily talking about sewing, Bao Chai and Aroma. Bao Chai laughs in the discussion about a very common everyday activity. So they're essentially in chapter 32, Bao Chai and Aroma are chatting about sewing and they're laughing and they're having a good time. It's a very common everyday activity, and in a single line, we learn suddenly that a maid, Golden, has committed suicide and drowned herself, right? So you have this unhappy moment embedded within a happy moment. Another example is the subtle introduction of Lin Dayu's tuberculosis just when she is realizing that her and Jia Baoyu are in fact soulmates. So in chapter 32 again, let's actually read that, page 131 to 132. We have a really good example of yin containing yang and vice versa. So this is a slightly lengthy passage, but not too bad. But let me read this to you, and you can see how you get one polarity that ends up containing another one. Dayu rightly surmised that now Xiangyun had arrived, Bao Yu would lose no time in telling her about his newly acquired qilin. Qilin is like a unicorn. It was a gold qilin unicorn. Now, Dayu had observed that in the romances which Bao Yu smuggled into her, of which she was nowadays an avid consumer, it was always some trinket or some object of clothing or jewelry, a pair of lovebirds, a male and female phoenix, a jade ring, a gold buckle, a silken handkerchief, an embroidered belt or whatnot, that brought the heroes and heroines together. And since the fate and future happiness of those fortunate beings seemed to depend wholly on the instrumentality of such trifling objects, it was natural for her to suppose that Bao Yu's acquisition of the gold qilin would become the occasion of a dramatic rupture with herself, and the beginning of an association with Xiang Yun, in which he and Xiang Yun would do together all those delightful things that she had read about in the romances. So here's Lin Dayu, who's essentially in this narrative has fallen for Jia Baoyu, and she's showing signs of jealousy. It was with such apprehensions that she made her way stealthily towards Green Delights, her intention being to observe how the two of them were behaving and shape her own actions accordingly. Imagine her surprise when, just as she was about to enter, she heard Xiang Yun lecturing Bao Yu on his social obligations, and Bao Yu telling Xiang Yun that, quote, cousin Lin never talked that sort of rubbish, and that if she did, he would have, quote, fallen out with her long ago. Mingled emotions of happiness, alarm, sorrow, and regret sailed her. Happiness, because after all, she thought, I wasn't mistaken in my judgment of you. I always thought of you as a true friend, and I was right. Alarm, because if you praise me so unreservedly in front of other people, your warmth and affection are sure, sooner or later, to excite suspicion and be misunderstood. Regret. Because if you are my friend, then I am yours, and the two of us are a perfect match. But in that case, why did there have to be all this talk of the golden jade? Remember, the golden jade is a kind of pairing between Bao Yu and Bao Chai. And Lin Dayu, of course, is jealous of that apparent match. Alternatively, if there had to be all this talk of golden jade, why weren't we the two to have them? Why did there have to be a Bao Chai with their golden locket? Sorrow. Because though there are things of burning importance to be said, without a father or mother, I have no one to say them for me. And besides, I feel so muzzy lately, and I know that my illness is gradually gaining hold on me. I know the doctors say that the weakness and anemia I suffer from may be the beginnings of consumption. So even if I am your true love, I fear I may not be able to wait for you. And even though you are mine, you can do nothing to alter my fate. At that point in her reflections, she began to weep, and feeling in no fit state to be seen, she turned away from the door and began to make her way back again. So again, in that long passage, Lin Dayu is both jealous of Bao Yu, that he might fall in with some other girl, and then he realizes by overhearing a discussion that he's having with someone else how much he shares the sentiments with her. So she realized that they're soulmates, and then within Yang, we see that she is sick with tuberculosis, and so there's this narrative way of using yin and yang in that way. So now we've seen how complex reading Mingqing fiction can be, right? It's very, very complicated, because if you're going to read Chinese literature from the Ming Dynasty and the Qing Dynasty, you really have to know Chinese philosophy, Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism. You have to know the fundamental contours of all the classical texts that have been published in the past. So you really have to be a very elite, well-educated person to get all the nuances. And people who were reading these xiaoshuo during the Ming and Qing period, they knew that. They knew that these books were very complicated. The authors had embedded within them these structural systems that were reliant upon this sort of education that you had to have. So we've seen how complex it is. So one of the conventions of the Chinese late imperial novel was called was to produce a short essay called the Dufa, right? That is an essay on how to read the book. So everyone assumed it was difficult. Let's go find someone who's actually mastered it, and that person will give us the sort of the key to the book, right? So the general function of these Dufa, of these how to read essays, was to instruct the reader on how to successfully access a given novel, right? So for example, The first How to Read essay was written by someone by the name of Jin Shentan, who I think he lived to 1608 to 1661. In any case, he wrote a commentary on a very famous novel called Shui Hu Zhuan, or Outlaws of the Marsh. And it's really a kind of a martial arts novel that kind of was the inspiration of the wuxia, the martial arts genre of even movies. So a whole bunch of sort of kung fu movies and kung fu novels all largely stem from the inspiration of this novel, right? So, but Ji Shantan wrote a Dufa, a how to read about the novel Outlaws of the Marsh, Shui Hu Zhuan, and that was published in 1589, right? So he's one of the very first, if not the very first, to essentially start this genre of writing little essays that are actually guides to reading certain novels. Now, these Dufa focus on issues regarding the critic's estimation of the novel's characters, by and large. And they're an attempt to figure out the author's motives for how the author structured the work. So these essayists are trying to figure out who are the characters, what are the motives that the author that inspired the author. Again, I think in an earlier moment I briefly mentioned Michel Foucault, who made this argument that there is no author. From the Chinese point of view, that is the most absurd notion. I mean, I certainly understand Foucault's argument, but nothing is sui generis except for the Tao itself. So these Dufa will be obsessive about sort of figuring out what the novelist, the writer, the author is saying. So they're generally numbered, right? So the Dufa will have numbers usually 1 through 100, and each of the numbered passages will offer a certain insight into how to read the novel, right? And the one thing that's really, really crucial, and it's almost like these lectures are a kind of Dufa, but one thing that these how to reads, these Dufas about Chinese novels assume is that you already know the novel very well, and you need to go that extra to that you need to access it in a more deep level. Right? So let's talk a little bit about the Dufa for Hong Lomeng. It's called the Hong Lomeng Dufa, the How to Read, Dream of the Red Chamber. It's by Zhang Xinzhi. I think he died around 1850, flourished from 1828 to 1850, something like that. And his studio name was Miao Fuxuan. Miao Fuxuan, so often you'll see his studio name, his sort of scholarly name, invoked rather than Zhang Xinzhi. But Zhang completed his commentary and his Dufa on Dream of the Red Chamber in 1850. So his commentary was finished around 1850, and it's called the Miao Fuxuan Ping Shitou Ji, Miao Fuxuan's commentary on the Story of the Stone. So he calls it the Story of the Stone, which is the alternative name for the novel. And his commentary, so he has both a commentary, so he writes commentary through the novel, both interlinear commentary, so there might be a line in the novel, and then he might say something in smaller characters in the line, or he might offer a kind of explanation at the beginning of the chapter, and then certainly he has this other thing called the Dufa, the How to Read. And it's curious because you have in the 1700s already in China these sort of exegetical texts that look like precursors to what would eventually end up being biblical exegetical texts, right? So you have scriptural scholars who do essentially the same kinds of thing, but much later. Not that there weren't commentaries written before the 18th century on the Bible or the Hebrew Bible. So Zhang notes that he had been reading Hong Lomeng since he was young, but he began his commentary in 1828 and finished it in 1850. So he worked on it for more than 20 years. He'd been reading it since he was a very young man, but then of course he decided to write this Dufa. It took him more than 20 years to write. And he actively completed it while he was actually on a visit in Taiwan. So he was at Taiwan when he finished the text. He was an itinerant scholar, so he was a traveling scholar who made a living as a secretary on the staff of government officials. So he would serve as a secretary for government officials as he traveled around. One of his friends borrowed his commentary on Honglomeng and ended up losing it. So Zhang Xinzhi had to start all over again. This is one of the problems in Chinese works, right? That they would often circulate their drafts, their manuscripts, and sometimes the manuscripts would not make it back to the author. So his commentary notes that he planned to publish an illustrated woodblock edition of his commentary, which would have been appended to the original text of Dream of the Red Chamber, but this never actually happened. So he was intended to have an illustrated version of the novel, but what ended up coming out with Zhang Xinzhi's commentary and his Dufa, his how to read, it was sans illustration. There were no illustrations included. He was a very famous. He was a very famous book collector, Zhang Xinzhi, and apparently he had an extremely rare copy of Shitoji or Honglomeng. And so I should also note here, right, that there are other commentaries on Dream of the Red Chamber, the novel, but Zhang Xinzhi's commentary is the one that has the Dufa, the how to read, that is very helpful for those of us who need that extra help. So beginning in the 1880s, new editions. So here's just some general points about the Dream of the Red Chamber and the text history. In the 1880s, new editions of Honglomeng really flooded the market, and they all had commentaries. So in the 1880s, you began to see just a flourishing market for this novel. It became very popular, and it was typically in Shanghai where the largest interest seemed to be. There is one source that says that in 1892, there were some 2,500 copies of Honglomeng sold in a single month. So this is of course using woodblock prints, right? So the text is being sold in great numbers. The first edition, the woodblock print edition of Zhang Xinzhi's commentary and his Dufa, was published in 1881. And his comments on Dream of the Red Chamber they tend to be quite strange at times, at least in my estimation. He certainly has a Confucian slant. So I would say that by and large, he is Confucian in the way he reads the novel. But some of the salient features of his commentary and his Dufa are let me just say a few things about them. The first thing he assumes is the reader is well read. Not only well read in the novel Dream of the Red Chamber, but well read in other novels too. So he mentions Jinping Mei, Plum in the Golden Vase. He mentions San Guo, Three Kingdoms. These are various novels, or Liao Zhai, Zhi Yi. So he mentions other classic texts. And bipolarity is a very common theme in all Chinese novels, but he particularly emphasizes reading the novel through the lens of Yin and Yang theory, bipolarity. And he states that Jinping Mei and Honglomeng are both divided by Re and Leng, by hot and cold. So he will say the whole novel of Dream of the Red Chamber is divided by hot and cold, Yang and Yin, specifically hot and cold. And you can see that through the novel, he'll say that there are these sections that are renao, that are hot and kind of worked up, they're just very stirred. And there are sections that are wuliao, that are boring. So, for example, you can see this in the garden, right? If you read Dream of the Red Chamber, just look for parts where Bao Yu or anyone is bored, or when that character happens to be bored. And when a character happens to be bored, rest assured, there's going to be something that's not quite boring, something that's very renao, sort of stirred up, that follows. You also see a polarity between sai, like wealth, and sa, and lust, right? So money will be very much something people are concerned with, and then suddenly there's some kind of a passage where there is some kind of romantic interest or lustful interest. And Zhang Xinzhi is very, very interested. He has a high concern for the novel's structure. So number 14 in his Dufa, is How to Read, notes that the book is 120 chapters, but the whole thing constitutes a cohesive whole. But there are smaller structural divisions, he says. So sometimes, he says, so the whole novel, 120 chapters, he says is one structural whole, but there will be these little, like 3-chapter or perhaps even 1 or 2 chapter sections that are their own little wholes. Like, what I mean by whole, I mean almost entire stories. All you need are those 3 chapters. But even though the whole thing has a cohesive whole, there are smaller cohesive wholes in the novel itself. He also mentions shadows, the so-called yin, something that I've talked about in other contexts. But these yin, he talks about the 2 main girls, Bao Chai and Dayu. Bao Chai, her shadow, her echo, I guess, is aroma, and Lin Dayu, her shadow or her echo is sky bright. And then you see scenes with Bao Yu and Bao Chai. They're depicted when they're together. Dayu will always appear afterward. If Dayu doesn't appear right afterward, then aroma or sky bright will appear afterward to substitute one of them, right? So i.e. these Bao Chai and aroma, or Dayu and sky bright, Cao Shuqin has deliberately used them in a way that they appear at certain moments strategically. So then there is a compositional principle that happens too, and that is he loves in his Dufa to talk about a cosmology. So he places in 5-phase cosmology, right? Wuxing. He places Xue Bao Chai in autumn, and others will place her in winter. But certainly he'll place people specifically into a season. Number 9, we also see that Zhang Xinzhi says that all of the poems within the novel have hidden meanings. Well, this is a key element to reading the novel. The poems are not just sort of filler. The poems are deeply embedded with hidden meanings that give things away. All of the characters' names have allegorical meanings. Yu, which means residence, applies to contain. So yu, you see that yu, that's the word Zhang Xinzhi uses, that all of the names yu are the resident. The name is the residence, the house of another meaning, right? So names house other meanings. The novel vacillates between, in terms of yin and yang, between action and inaction. And then he divides the whole novel into 3 fundamental sections in his How to Read. Chapters 1 through 36, chapters 40 through 69, and chapters 71 through 113. Of course, there are 120 chapters, but fundamentally, those are the cores of the 3 sections. And some say that Cao only wrote up to chapter 80. And Zhang Xinzhi, he responds by exclaiming the work's perfect cohesiveness. So he works against the idea that Cao Shuqin did not finish the novel. There's a passage in the Dufa that says something like, "Shou wei xiang yin," from head to tail, everything responds in a perfect cohesiveness. Zhang states that, and this is the part I'll end with this, and this is the part that I find most problematic. When I read it, it actually causes me to sort of raise my eyebrows and wonder what the heck is he saying. But Zhang Xinzhi states that the entire novel, Dream of the Red Chamber, follows the ideas of the I Ching, the classic of changes. And he uses the progression of the hexagrams in the text, the I Ching, as a template for the narrative events for the novel. I'll leave you with that because I know that I've been receiving, and I'm so delighted to have received emails that have questions about the text. And delightful email this morning I read said "gentle professor," and that was a great beginning to this day, this beautiful spring day here in Spokane, Washington. But I'll leave you with that because I have a question, and my question is, can somebody help clarify how the I Ching can be used as a template? That is quite a confusing section for me. Well, I do wish everyone Juni Santi Jiankang, the most wonderful of health. And if you wish to know what will happen in the next lecture, you'll have to stay tuned for the next posting. Thank you so much, and keep reading.